It is an historic night in Manhattan. Former President Trump is a convicted felon after being found guilty by a jury of his peers.
After 5 weeks of testimony, a verdict was handed up in the hush money trial just after 5 p.m. tonight. This is the first criminal trial of a former U.S. president. The jury of 7 men and 5 women ruled Trump guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. During the trial, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg's team argued Trump was part of a hush money scheme involving adult film star Stormy Daniels. It was all in an effort to suppress damaging information before the 2016 election.
We have team coverage for you set up in Lower Manhattan this evening. We've already heard from the major players in the case, including the former president himself, and DA Bragg just spoke out a few moments ago as well.
CBS 2's Alice Gaynor was one of about 60 journalists with a seat in the main courtroom, and she has been there every day of this trial, which began on April 15th.
And CBS 2's Dick Brennan also downtown right now. They kick off our team coverage this evening. Dick and Alice.
Christina and Maurice, the protesters are still shouting in the park around us, but all the real drama, Alice, was inside that courtroom when those counts were read. What was it like, this really extraordinary moment?
That's right. And, you know, it was dramatic just because around 4:14, the judge came in. We hadn't heard from the jury all day, and he said, I'm going to give them a few more minutes, and then I'm going to dismiss them at 4:30. So the note was at 4:20. We didn't hear it until after 4:30. The judge said, I just received a note from the jury. They've reached a verdict. They would like some more time, about 30 minutes, to fill out the forms. Is that okay? There was an audible gasp in the courtroom from journalists and members of the public because we thought jurors were getting dismissed for the day. That's why that moment in particular was dramatic. However, when the verdict itself was read, it was quiet in that courtroom. All you could hear was the furious typing that journalists were doing. Members of the public were sitting behind me. Court officers had already instructed them no outbursts of any kind, and they were quiet. We could not see the former president's reaction because they cut the video feed. What I mean by that is in the front of the courtroom, they have about 4 large monitors. We are sitting behind him, so obviously we cannot see his face. But if we use binoculars and if we look at those monitors, there's a camera facing the defense table, facing the judge, facing the prosecution, not facing the jury because they are anonymous, but we can usually see his expression if you look closely at the monitor and use binoculars. So we could not see in that moment. Before that moment, he was sitting there expressionless, eyes closed. After the verdict was read, as he was exiting the courtroom, I was sitting close to the middle aisle. So I had a shot of him when he was walking out. He went to reach for his son, Eric Trump, who has been in the courtroom a few times, and his face was red. He was sweating, and he looked obviously very angry. He walked out, and then he addressed the cameras in the hallway.
Yeah, moments later he addressed them. We have that. Let's hear from the former president right now.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
Alice, you said what the former president looked like as he walked out. What were the jurors doing? Did they look nervous? How were they reacting?
You know, they've kept quite the poker face throughout this entire trial. We really didn't see many expressions, facial expressions from them at all. They've been paying attention, and they exited the courtroom. They did not look in his direction. When they enter the courtroom each day, they also don't look at him. They don't look at the prosecution's table either, though. Sometimes there's one gentleman who looks at him and looks at both tables, but today everyone had their heads down, walked right in, which again is not unusual. That's typically what they do. They're an anonymous jury, Dick, so we don't know if we're going to hear from them because we do not know their names. The attorneys knew their names, but we do not. And some of them, I want to point out, 2 were not born here in the United States. One was from Lebanon, one was from Ireland, and they also have various occupations. 2 are attorneys.
2 attorneys, one who said he didn't know much about criminal law.
Civil litigator and a corporate attorney, and they said during selection, I don't know much about criminal law. So it would be interesting to know how that played an effect in the jury deliberation room, you know, whether those lawyers were able to help at all, but perhaps not, because they asked for a readback of some of the instructions this morning from the judge's instructions to the jury.
Now, you had 20-plus witnesses witnesses there. Some of them, as you described, sort of mundane people talking about ledgers. But then Stormy Daniels will come in another day. Michael Cohen would come in another day. What was that up and down in that courtroom? And you never really knew what was coming next, right?
You know, I think people were bracing themselves for explosive testimony from Michael Cohen, but that just wasn't the case. He kept the same calm tone and demeanor, even as on cross-examination the defense tried to, catch him in certain moments, even though defense attorney Todd Blanche at one moment raised his voice in a really high pitch and, called him a liar. He never broke from his even tone when he was testifying on the stand. As for Stormy Daniels, when she first got up there, she was talking very quickly and a few times had to be told.
They said she was a little nervous, they thought she was. Yeah.
And she was going into perhaps a little bit of too much detail. The defense was objecting to certain things surrounding the alleged
very
act
tawdry, too much, right?
Right. But for the most part, I wouldn't say there was a moment where there were any, major theatrics or drama in that courtroom. It very much felt like just a proceeding that was happening, if that makes sense.
Quite the opposite from the former president, who many described they thought he was sleeping half the time.
Unless you're standing next to him, we can't say for certain he was sleeping, but we noticed his eyes were closed a lot. And actually, I noticed, now I can't remember, the day's been very long, whether it was today or yesterday, his head slumped over at one point, and I thought to myself, he's got to be sleeping. But I don't know if that's by design. We don't know. We tried asking him, the reporters in the hallway, were you sleeping? Do you have your eyes closed on purpose? We don't know whether that was his way of, kind of protesting what was going on. I don't know how that played with the jury. I mean, the jury we can't see his face because we're behind him, but the jury has a full view of everything.
And this is a former president. They had a tremendous weight on them. They knew the world was literally watching. And then apparently, though, like many jurors in New York, they just did their duty, right?
That's right. And now it's up to the judge for sentencing July 11th at 10 a.m. But back to the jury for a moment. You may remember jury selection took 4 days. They would bring in a pool of prospective jurors, 96. I think it was a second pool of 96. Dozens were excused because they were asked if they could be fair and impartial. Many said they could not, and so they were excused. There were a few that seemed to be selected, and then they thought about it overnight, came in. They were very stressed. They were very anxious. They said, I can't do this. So these jurors, what's interesting is sometimes in a trial, an alternate will have to come in for one reason or another. There was no need for the alternates in this trial. Every juror was there on time.
Yeah.
That's another thing.
Early.
I mean, they did their job.
And another thing around this courthouse here, you had Harvey Weinstein trial, or at least some appearances here. Menendez also here, and Trump. I mean, it was somewhat of a three-ring circus going on here, and kind of still is tonight.
And that's the same courtroom where where that trial took place. So same exact one, and he had an appearance yesterday, and they had to move him to a different courtroom. And of course, Menendez, as you mentioned, is around the corner at federal court.
All right.
But right now, it's pretty quiet here, we have to say.
Finally, one more big day in July, and you will be there, no doubt.
That's right.
All right. Christina, Maurice, back to you.
Hey, guys, just one more thing for Alice. I mean, you've sat through every last detail of this case, start to finish. You digested every morsel. Did today surprise you in any way, the kind of speed that this came down with?
It did not, Maurice. Again, we can never predict when a verdict is going to come in, what the jury is thinking. But I said to a couple of people, you're talking to other journalists online in the mornings. We have to get here so early before court even opens. And I said, I don't know. I think it's today. And other people thought, no, it's going to be tomorrow. Some other people, some attorneys and a retired judge thought it would be next week. So it was today.
But again,
I mean, no inside knowledge.
You never know what a jury's going to do, as you know, Maurice and Christine.
Exactly. You never know. Okay, guys, thank you. Excellent work and insight there. We'll come back to you soon. Appreciate it.
We want to continue our special team coverage now of this conviction of former President Trump.
As soon as the guilty verdict was read on all 34 counts, the crowd started reacting outside the courthouse. CBS 2's Derek Waller live now with more on the reaction. Derek.
And Maurice, Christine, Dick just mentioned a three-ring circus, and that's a little bit of what we had out here about an hour or so ago. We're standing at Center and Worth Streets, and things have really calmed down, as they mentioned. Behind me, you see that Center Street is back open to traffic. About an hour ago, it was shut down, but we can show you a little bit of what that looked like a little while ago. You can see on your screen some of the anti-Trump protesters that had been gathered here down the street. Police were kind of keeping them separate, but you had some pro-Trump protesters as well. Very vocal, but I would say it's very small groups of protesters. We did speak with some of them a little while ago. Here's a little bit of what they had to say.
This is criminal, and what he did is really serious, and it was election interference, and I'm really glad the jury came in with their verdict.
We're both in shock, but I think it's actually going to help them. I think it'll bring attention to what a farce this was, and we're going to add support, and we're still going to win.
So that's a little bit of a flavor of the different opinions that we got out here. But again, not a lot of protesters, and now it's really dwindling. I would say right now there's more press than protesters, which is often the case with these situations. But yes, an historic day, and really it's quieting down as the evening goes on. Maurice, Christine, I'll send it back to you.
Okay,
all right,
Derek Waller, thank you so much. And we saw just a few minutes ago, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg speaking for the first time since the verdict, using words like gratified and respect and honor and all these sorts of words, talking about the work that they put into it and the team that he says he's so proud of.
Absolutely. The first thing he mentioned was the jurors. CBS 2's Tim McNicholas is live in Lower Manhattan with what else Bragg had to say today. Tim?
Right, Christina, Maurice, we have heard Trump try to paint this whole trial as something that was unfair and unique to other trials. Bragg very deliberately tried to describe it as a case that he says he handled just like any other. He also described the jury at least twice as, quote, everyday jurors or everyday New Yorkers. He said this is the kind of white-collar prosecution that is core to what his office does. And as you mentioned, he also thanked his prosecuting team and the jurors. I think we have a soundbite from what he said earlier. If we could play that right now, that'd be great.
Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election.
So we often learn more from these press conferences from the question portion than we do from the opening statement. But today, DA Bragg really only took a few questions. He was giving very measured responses to those questions as well. He was asked at one point if he has a response to the criticism and insults that Trump has thrown at him throughout this whole process. He simply said, no, I do not. He was also asked if he will request prison time for Trump. And he said that the judge has requested, or scheduled, I should say, a sentencing for July. And he simply said that him and his prosecuting team will speak in court at that time. No doubt the rest of the country will be anxiously awaiting and listening to see what he says in July.
Tim, during his news conference just moments ago, he did make a point to mention, like, listen, this is what we do every day here at the DA's office. We try these cases, we follow the facts, and this is what we do every single day. It seemed as though he was really trying to minimize the gravity of what took place here today.
Right, and I think that is in direct response to what Trump and his allies have been saying. They've been doing the complete opposite, trying to make this out to be a case or a trial that is totally unique and unlike any other, and that may have been handled unfairly in some way. Well, Bragg took this very deliberate approach today of doing the complete opposite, saying this is a case that he handled like any other. He even went into the history of the DA's office a little bit and how they have handled over the years certain cases like this, white-collar crimes, which, again, he said white-collar prosecutions like this are at the core of what his office does day in and day out.
And then there was an interesting moment when the lead prosecutor, Steinglass, was given an opportunity to answer a question. Take us through how that played out, Tim.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, I don't think he actually responded to the question. He let Alvin Bragg do all the talking today. Again, Bragg was very measured in his responses. There's a good reason for that, I'm sure. He probably does not want to say anything that will taint public opinion or somehow give Trump more fuel for any of this, but he was very deliberate in the way he responded, and again, he only responded to a few questions today.
All right, interesting moments there. Tim McNicholas, thank you so much, with the district attorney's reaction tonight. We're going to take a break here. When we come back in just a moment, we'll bring you reaction from Trump Tower.
All right, welcome back to our continuing coverage here of the conviction of former President Donald Trump. As you can imagine, there is reaction all over the city. Chopper 2 over Trump Tower right now, where we do see some people outside of the apartment complex there. We can't really tell if they are protesters or supporters. However, we can say that a caravan of cars, the same cars that we saw the former president transported in from the courthouse to Trump Tower, are still outside his apartment. Let's go to CBS 2's Dan Rice. He's overhead. Dan, what are you seeing?
Well, at this point, Christine, what we're looking at is the caravan that you spoke of. It appears that the former president will be coming back out to those cars. Where he may be going, it's not clear at this point. We're just going to get around this one building here. And usually what we've noticed over the different trials that we've covered is when these cars are all lined up here, and you see that one gentleman with the door open to the back of the vehicle, the arrival of the former president is pretty imminent, so we're pretty sure they should be coming out here momentarily. But as you said, across the street over on 5th Avenue, we have seen a large group of people still gathered outside here, more towards the West 56th Street side of the intersection. Not clear if it is just a mix of media members and supporters or protesters. We've seen a bunch of people standing there on the sidewalk. It's been relatively peaceful out here, though, for most of the day. That's a good thing from when we've been out here. But again, we're just going to keep our eye over here on East 56th Street and waiting to see if the former president does jump back into that car and where he's going to head off to when he leaves Trump Tower.
Right, Dan Rice, thank you for that update. And we are also on the ground there outside of Trump Tower.
And that's where CBS 2's Dave Carlin is, right there at 56th and 5th Avenue. Dave, what do you see?
Well, right here, street level and on the sidewalk. I'm going to begin by showing you the scene over this way because you'll see a lot of American flags here on the west side of 5th Avenue between 56th Street and 57th Street. And we're also going to talk about that 6:15 arrival here when the former president arrived at his residence right here, Trump Tower, and people made a lot of noise. We've been talking about whether or not this would be, protesters one way or the other, and actually it's both sides and a lot of tourists as well, and some tourists asking what's going on here with a lot less passion about the topic. And then let's hear from some of the people that we gathered up out here on the sidewalk and talked to.
But I guess everything will pull through. It's Trump. He always does. A great guy. Besides what everybody says about him, I think he's going to make America great again.
As him, as everybody else, we should all be, treated fairly in the justice system. And this whole thing is just crooked. It's so wrong. I support him so much because he's for us. He's genuinely for us.
That took a lot of courage for that jury to come back with that kind of a charge against him. I just think it's amazing.
To me, it's very clear. It's very clear that he's guilty.
People out here, despite their political persuasion, they want to know what's next. What we do know is that the sentencing hearing is July 11th, but people want to know something beyond that, like the schedule where the former president will be at any given time as we lead up to that. And of course, that's something that's not completely hammered down or even figured out. And of course, even what's going on tonight, we don't know for sure, and that's why we're here to see when he exits his residence, Trump Tower, where we are live. Dave Carlin, CBS 2 News.
All right, Dave, thank you. And we are told that moments ago the former president did jump into the car and take off. Chopper 2 is overhead. This is Dan Rice giving us a look right now on the ground. Dan, what do you see? Where are they going?
And Maurice, as Dave was talking there, we did see the former president exit the building, get into the back of that SUV that we were talking about. Now they're heading out 56th Street. Typically what they'll do is that they're going back over towards the east side of Manhattan. They'll make that left-hand turn you see going up to Madison Avenue, get back on the 57th Street, work their way over towards the east side. But again, it's going to be a little hard to get around the buildings here. But at this point, we do not have any word yet as to where he may be going. I did take a little peek over to LaGuardia Airport. That's where the Trump airplane usually sits, and from what I can tell from the distance that we were looking at, the airplane does not appear to be ready to go for a flight. So it's not clear yet where in the city or where in the tri-state the former president could be heading to at this time, but we'll do our best to follow him through the city. Maurice and Christine.
Okay, Dan, as best you can tell, I guess you can't tell right now. The buildings are in the way, but they're just following traffic like anybody else, right? They don't get to go through red lights?
It was when he left the courthouse, they had the police escort, and they were going through the intersections. They did have the police blocking off the intersections, but with this motorcade, when we saw it leave a few seconds ago, I didn't notice the police escort in front of the motorcade. So when we catch back up with it, we'll try to get an idea if they are running interference and blocking off the intersections, or if they just have to sit in traffic like he did when he came up the Trump Tower a few hours ago.
Okay.
All right, Dan. Well, just some of the possibilities, just basing this judgment on past instances. He's gone and he's done fundraisers after big days, you know, and setbacks like this. He's also met with supporters privately in instances like this. So we don't quite know where the former president is heading. But according to Dan, given the fact that his private airplane is not on the tarmac at the airport, or awaiting his arrival anyway, we can just assume that he is heading somewhere in the city. And of course, we will continue to keep an eye on that situation.
We do know the fundraising emails are out.
They are.
They are, certainly.
With a vengeance. 3 so far since the guilty verdicts were handed up.
That's right. All right, we're going to take a break here. When we come back, we'll hear what Michael Cohen has had to say after the verdict, right after this. Just a few moments ago, as we get into the aftermath of the Trump verdict here, we saw Michael Cohen leave his Manhattan apartment.
CBS 2's Naveen Dhaliwal is live there now. Naveen, did he have any comment?
Yeah, Christine, Michael Cohen had a lot to say in court, but as he left his Upper East Side apartment just around 7 o'clock, that was about 25 minutes ago, he had nothing to say. He walked out, our cameras caught him, out of the front door of his apartment here on Park Avenue. At one point, he looked at our cameras, and then he got into a livery SUV, a black SUV. Now, Cohen was a key witness, as you all know, in this case, telling the jury that he had intimate knowledge of that hush money payments that were made before the 2016 election. Cohen, known as a self-described fixer before Trump became president, and during this case, Cohen made a became a fierce critic of his now former boss. Now, in the court, you may remember, you know, his testimony really nailed a lot of this case, where he said back in October 2016 he paid Stormy Daniels $130,000 of his own money, of his pocket money, in exchange for her silence. Now, prosecutors say Cohen received 11 checks from Trump that were falsely classified as legal fees to cover up the deal with Daniels. And Cohen testified that Trump had approved of this plan to reimburse him. Now, it's unclear what Cohen was thinking as he left his apartment. It's unclear where he was going at this time, but being a lawyer himself and being very close to this case, he might have some sort of an inkling of what the outcome of this trial may have been. Back to you.
Dhaliwal, thank you so much. Nothing from Michael Cohen just yet. All right, we will move on here to see some of the video as the former president left his apartment there on 56th Street at 5th Avenue, getting into the back of a vehicle with the escort of the Secret Service. He then went on 56, made a left up Madison, and that's where the chopper then followed him to points unknown. At this point, we're not sure if he's going to get to LaGuardia to get out of town. Dan Rice told us that it didn't appear that the chopper, or rather his private plane, is ready for takeoff or ready to leave just yet. So we'll keep an eye on that for you.
Absolutely. It is a quick, though, turnaround, because we saw him arrive there at his apartment building after 6 o'clock tonight, and just over an hour spending time there to regroup and then off to his next destination. Of course, we'll try to figure out where that is and get that information to you as soon as possible. In the meantime, we're going to take a quick break. On the other side, we will hear from our political and legal analysts about what comes next.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man.
Donald Trump's reaction this afternoon, right after the verdict today, guilty on all 34 counts. Going to get into the legal and political implications of all of this, and there are many.
Joining the conversation, CBS 2 political reporter Marcia Kramer, and also a law professor from Hofstra, James Sample. Welcome to you both. Quite a day here in New York City. Your reaction to this overwhelming and undeniably guilty verdict?
It's an extraordinary day. It's history. It's not necessarily the history, the kind of history that the country wants to make necessarily. Certainly not going into it, but it is a remarkable, remarkable thing. And I really think a lot about the jurors who spent 5 weeks in that Manhattan courtroom listening to the evidence, looking at the documents very carefully, listening to all the witnesses. And I think about the job that the New York District Attorney's Office did here. Particularly in the waning days. Joshua Steinglass a couple days ago going in past 8 p.m. and those jurors who had been there early on in the morning listening to testimony, locked in their seats, not able to talk to each other about the case, listening to all of this narrative. And when it all piled up, you started with David Pecker, you had Michael Cohen at the end, and in between, it was almost like a staccato presentation. There were bombshell witnesses and then relative unknowns, people we'd never heard of, but those people oftentimes were the ones who had the documentary evidence. They were the ones who had the phone call records, the meeting records, the opportunities, the wire transfers with the handwritten notes of the CFO. That kind of a staccato presentation ended up being extraordinarily effective.
And then the DA at the end, he said he's proud of his team. He went on to really congratulate them. And then at the end, he said, I did my job and they did theirs. What did you make of his reaction afterwards?
I thought it was a remarkably understated and sort of restrained statement on his part. You know that this has to be something that in his mind he considers a crowning achievement, and it's a historic moment for him, for the country, and he's a big part of bringing it about. But he's also aware that this is going to be a process and it's going to take time. So he said, for example, in response to a question as to whether or not he'd be seeking incarceration for the former president, he said, we'll address that on July 11th when we speak at the sentencing hearing. This is a measured, careful approach, and it's indicative of how the DA's office handled the entire case.
And Marcia, because he can't politicize this, he needs to be careful, because that's exactly what Donald Trump is doing.
Well, he can't politicize it, but you have to also look at this as a political victory for Alvin Bragg, because everybody said of all the cases that were brought, this was the weakest case. And the fact that he at first wasn't going to try the case, and then looked at the evidence again and said, I'm going to bring it, and everybody criticized him for doing it, and then he gets a victory. This is, remember, he has to stand for re-election too. So this is a big political victory for Alvin Bragg. And I know he's not going to take a victory lap, but people will be talking about it for months to come.
Speaking of the politics here, we've seen Donald Trump sent out at least 3 fundraising emails in the last 2 hours since the verdict has been read. What are we expecting to happen next here?
Well, first of all, he is trying to raise as much money as possible and capitalize on the, quote, rage of his supporters that they will contribute money to him. Remember, there's something very interesting going on. Actually, even though with all his support, Joe Biden has raised more money so far than Donald Trump. And so he wants to use this to raise a whole bunch of money to use in the campaign. But again, what we have to ask ourselves is this: what effect politically is this going to have?
Right.
And I think it has to still sink in people's minds, and people have to start asking themselves, do we want a convicted felon as the president of the United States? I mean, he stands convicted. So the question then becomes, where is this going to have an effect? The 7 battleground states, which until recent polls, Trump was leading in 5 of the 7 states. But we have to take a look at polls in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Now, CBS polling has indicated, and this is before it happened, that about 15% of voters, Republican voters, said they might change their mind about Trump if he was convicted. Now, we don't know whether that holds up after the conviction, but it gives wiggle room for Joe Biden and voters for Joe Biden to go after, because even though Trump was ahead in those states, he was only ahead by 4 or 5 points.
And those states are everything. The swing states are everything.
States, they're everything.
In the election.
And if even 2 or 3 points changes, Joe Biden can win.
That's true. Professor, you were talking about the fact that convicted of these charges, you can still run you can still run for president. Can you vote for yourself? And what is the quirk that allows that to be the case?
It's a great question, Maurice. And, you know, the Constitution is an extraordinarily short document. You think about this document. It's been around for basically 250 years, and it's held the country together. It is the framework of a nation, but it is extraordinarily short when you consider the amount of work that it does. Article 2 sets out the qualifications for the presidency. You have to be a natural-born citizen. You have to have attained the age of 35 years. Beyond that, Amendment 22 was adopted to essentially establish term limits for the presidency. You can't have served two terms already, right after FDR. Other than that, the Constitution doesn't set any requirements for the office. It's up to the voters. And so being a convicted felon is not disqualifying in terms of running for office, even though in many states, being a convicted felon would prevent you from voting for yourself. Now, because Donald Trump votes in Florida, and because Florida honors the law of the state in which you were convicted, which is New York.
We're following.
And because New York is relatively progressive on these issues, and only felons who are actually incarcerated are prevented from voting, Donald Trump gets to vote in Florida by benefit of New York law.
Well, there we go.
Okay.
Right, complete circle there.
Crystal clear. We fully get it.
So I don't mean to interrupt, but I'd like to talk about this appeal. The defense has made it clear that they plan to appeal immediately, and I'd like to get your thoughts because, you know, Trump immediately said, you know, this is a disgrace, this is rigged. He also mentioned they didn't allow a change of venue. Do you expect these are all things that could be brought up in support of an appeal?
I think those are the arguments he'll make outside the context of the litigation. You know, for example, he says, oh, why, they wouldn't give us a change of venue or in a jurisdiction where we're at 5 or 6%. What is he referencing at 5 or 6%? He's talking about his polling numbers in Manhattan. If you don't want to be tried in a particular jurisdiction, don't commit crimes in that jurisdiction. There's no venue rule that is a function of your polling numbers in that a change of venue based on polling numbers. Think about if that were our legal system. Right. It's just not. I think his lawyers will make strong legal arguments. I don't think they'll be successful. I think they have arguments based in the law. They're not going to be able to overturn the jury's fact-finding. That's sacrosanct, right? The domain of the jury is to listen to things and determine things like credibility, to weigh the evidence. That's what the jury did. If the Trump team is going to pursue these appeals, which they absolutely will, they will focus on the unprecedented nature of these particular falsification of business records charges being elevated to the felonies that they are because of the pursuit of unlawful means, additional unlawful means. And that here is either the federal election laws, New York state tax laws, or other falsification of business records. And so that is the area that initially, and you know, people talked about this being the weakest of the 4 cases initially. That was the perceived weak point. But the district attorney's office got over the hurdle. They got over that hurdle. They brought this case. They were successful. And it will be difficult, not impossible, but it will be very difficult to challenge this verdict on appeal.
I mean, the next place they go to the appellate level in New York, then the state's highest court, the Court of Appeals.
That's right.
Could they end up in federal courts in any way, shape, or form? Could you imagine that?
In order to get jurisdiction in an appeal from a state conviction, it has to go all the way up. You have to exhaust your state appeals. So as you say, it would go to the appellate division in New York, then to the New York Court of Appeals. And then if you can find a federal issue that would result in a reversal of your conviction, you can file for a petition for certiorari, but you can only do that on a federal basis. Most of this case, the vast majority of the case, is New York law. They can try and make a due process federal claim out of it. It'll be a long shot.
Marcia, you know, Donald Trump did not testify in this case. Do you think he regrets that?
I don't think he regrets it one bit. I think that if he had gone onto the stand and they could prove that he perjured himself, that would have been a huge felony. So they wanted to avoid that. But one thing I'd like to talk to you about in terms of the court situation, it's going to take so long for this appeal process to be carried out. I mean, first you go to the appellate division and you argue, and then they rule, and then you go to the Court of Appeals, and then you argue and you rule. By the time all this is done, we're going to be past the election, we're going to be into January. He may be president, he may not be president. And whether he wins or not will probably also affect, you know, where this goes and whether the other cases are being brought. Because remember, there are 3 other cases that they could actually be tried on. He could actually be tried on.
All right, so much more to sort through here. Marcia, thank you. Professor, thank you as well. Great insight. We're going to take a break here. We're back with much more of the aftermath of the verdict. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Let's take you to Times Square right now. CBS 2's Zania Maldonado there with what people are saying as they gather there tonight. Zania?
Well, as you know, Maurice, here in Times Square, you're going to see folks from not only all over across the city, state, country, but the globe. And everybody has something to say about a U.S. former president being convicted for the very first time. Some people say they are shocked. Some people are not so shocked. One of the common denominators, though, among the folks that we spoke to is confidence in the U.S. justice system. And many of them, though, say they're now on the edge of their seats waiting to see what is going to happen next. Take a listen.
It's insane. That's never happened before in history. So this is something that we're living, and I don't even know how this is going to turn out. I'm shocked. Honestly, I'm shocked.
For the most part, most people anyway abroad, we're from Europe, most of us thought he was guilty. Most of us think he is guilty.
I mean, we all kind of saw it coming, didn't we? But it's like, it's actually happened now, so mad.
I think it's a little bit strange. I wish that it hadn't had to happen like that, but I think justice is always going to be served.
I wasn't surprised, but I'd be very surprised if he gets any serious time off the back of it.
And more specifically, a lot of the people we spoke to very interested to see how the election is going to pan out, and of course, his sentencing. We're live from Times Square. Zania Maldonado, CBS 2 News.
Okay, Zania, thank you.
CBS 2's Alice Gaynor was one of about 60 journalists with a seat in the main courtroom, and she has been there every day of this trial, which began on April 15th.
And she joins us now live. Alice, I'm wondering, a couple hours and a half or so since the verdict, what are your thoughts at the moment?
Well, I want to point out, you may notice behind me, the metal barricades are now gone from in front of the courthouse. NYPD officers have been removing them as of a short time ago, so things feel quiet here. There were some protesters in the park. People seem to be dispersing right now. A lot of crews, media here from all over the world. Now, it was very interesting in court today because around 4:14, the judge came in and said, I'm going to give the jury a few more moments and then I'm going to dismiss them at 4:30. All of a sudden, he came back in a little after 4:30, and I was wondering, gosh, it's after 4:30. Shouldn't they be dismissed now? He said, I have a note from the jury, and the note was dated with a timestamp of 4:20 this afternoon. It said that the jury had reached a verdict, but they were requesting 30 more minutes to fill out the verdict sheet, the proper forms. So we couldn't believe it. There was an audible gasp when the judge read that note because, again, everyone had sent their updates and posted that the jury had no verdict today and they were going to be sent home. And then all of a sudden that note came in, and it had been pretty quiet in the courtroom all day. There was one note this morning, and that was to clarify a note from yesterday. The jury was requesting readback of the judge's instructions, in particular page 6 to about 36. So about 30 pages were read back of the 55-page instruction. I spoke with a retired judge who's been in the courtroom every day observing this trial. I wanted to know his thoughts on what the jury requested in their notes, and he thought that that was very telling. They were requesting testimony readback of Michael Cohen and also of David Pecker, namely the 2015 Trump Tower meeting with Trump, during which Pecker, on the stand, testified he volunteered to be the eyes and ears of the Trump campaign. The other thing they requested this morning, headphones. They wanted to be able to better hear the audio evidence that was submitted because they were working off of a laptop. This laptop had no Wi-Fi. The only thing on it were all of the exhibits so that while they were deliberating in the jury room, they could pull up all of these different things. So the judge said they could get headphones and they could also get speakers so that they could all hear this. The one thing they don't have the transcript. So anytime they wanted to hear back testimony, they were brought back in this morning, and 2 court reporters, stenographers, assumed the roles of Michael Cohen, David Pecker, actors they are not. So one of them had a very thick New York accent, and we were hearing them read back this testimony that Cohen gave on the stand and that David Pecker gave on the stand as well. So after the readback this morning, all quiet. We went through lunch, we came back this afternoon, and again, we thought they were going to be done for the day, and then, lo and behold, end of the day, verdict.
Alice, you know, the DA and both the judge mentioned how important the jury's work was in this case. The DA thanking the jury, the judge saying how stressful this was for every member of the jury. You mentioned that when they returned to the courtroom after reaching their verdict, that they did not look at the former president. I'm curious, though, once they were finished reading the verdicts and once that was all complete in the courtroom, what was their demeanor like then? Did they have a sense of relief that this was over, or did they still look as serious and as attentive as they always have since day one of this case?
Christine, total poker face. I mean, throughout this trial, occasionally we'd see them smile if an attorney sort of cracked a joke, but really could not get a read on any of them. That's how serious they were taking this case. So when they got up and they were dismissed, no expression on their faces that I could see. They were going back to the jury room, and the judge was going to thank them properly for their service. He thanked them in the courtroom, but the judge mentioned he was going to go back, he was going to talk to them. He was also going to get their feedback on the proceeding and, you know, any criticisms, any critiques, any suggestions for running things better, I suppose, in the courtroom. He was going to ask them as well. It's an anonymous jury, so we don't know their names. The attorneys on both sides do, but the public, the press, we do not. And it's believed they exited out the back. Perhaps they were taken away in a van, but we have not spoken to any of these jurors yet.
One final thought here, Alice. After listening to every last detail and morsel of this trial, and now it's over. What are you left with? What are you left with? What are your thoughts at this moment?
Well, I can resume my sleep schedule, but I will say, you know, this ran like any other criminal proceeding I've seen here in this courthouse. Yes, this was the former president, but when you take someone out of their element and you put them in this courtroom, it's just something that makes them seem so human. So in a lot of ways, this felt like I was watching any other proceeding I've seen here in this courthouse. And I have to say, professionalism, these court officers, I mean, they really kept everyone in line, orderly, and they kept everyone safe.
So interesting. Alice Gaynor, thanks for the reporting and the insight. Truly appreciate it. Thanks.
We are going to take a quick break right now, and on the other side, we'll have a final word from our political and legal analysts about what comes next.
Welcome back. We're joined with our team here, Marcia Kramer, our political reporter, and James Sample, professor of law at Hofstra. Marcia is poring over the latest emails that are coming in. These are literally Trump supporter directed emails, fundraisers, and they're coming at a pretty high clip.
Well, not only that, but he's just announced that tomorrow at 11 o'clock at Trump Tower, I hate to do this because now he's going to get more people, but he's going to speak about what happened. This is now the 5th time that he sent out a press release since 5/21, minutes after he was convicted. But he's been sending out fundraising letter after fundraising letter, and he's also sending out other press releases saying he's being supported by people all over the country with quotes from his Republican supporters. So this is an ongoing thing as he tries to monetize the fact that he's been convicted. And
well,
I think
the House Speaker has commented about the conviction today, as many of his allies have in Washington, D.C.
Elise Stefanik, almost every political person that wants to get in his team has commented. People who want to run for vice president have commented, all of his supporters. But I think the key thing here, that he is really trying to monetize this so that he can make money to run for president. And not only that, but I also have a question wondering whether he can use any of his campaign funds, I think you could probably answer that, to pay for his legal bills, which have clearly mounted to the millions of dollars. And I believe that he can use campaign funds to do that. So that's why he's in this big push, because he's going to mount not only appeals, which are expensive, but then he's going to need money to run against Joe Biden.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that he's been fundraising off of this, and that the fundraising has often been sort of there's a diversion of some of that money, and it goes into the Trump legal defense, which, if you're a part of his campaign, defending him against these charges is certainly relevant and germane to the campaign. But it is a telling state of affairs when the fundraising for the President of the United States is being used in part to pay for a legal defense in criminal cases.
Well,
that's not a great sign for...
Yeah,
but you know, you have
right.
to understand one thing. He's using it by saying he's a political prisoner, and therefore people should contribute to him. And I think it's really interesting that he is now starting to campaign again tomorrow morning in front of Trump Tower, that he's going to try to use this again as another fundraising thing and a big campaign event.
Yeah, not surprising, since grievance is at the heart of a lot of what he does out there on the campaign trail. We were also remarking during the break about how, I don't know if we can show the video of him leaving Trump Tower, but it's kind of a full circle moment when he came down that escalator at Trump Tower back in the 2016 campaign, and now to go back home and leave the building again after being convicted on 34 counts today.
What a difference 9 years can make, right? I mean, it's really extraordinary to think about the journey, and the nation has been there every step of the way. I mean, there's not been a lack of attention paid to Donald Trump over the last decade for very good reasons, but it is a striking juxtaposition to think about going down that escalator, a crowd of adoring fans, and I'm sure they'll try and recreate some of that tomorrow politically for the visuals of it, but it's a very different circumstance for sure.
All right, Professor Sample from Hofstra Law, appreciate it. Marcia Kramer, as always, thanks for the insight. We're going to continue our coverage here of the aftermath of Donald Trump being convicted here, all 34 counts. We're bringing the latest from the main players in the case, as well as reaction from New Yorkers just like you, coming up at 8 o'clock right here on CBS 2 WLNY as well.
Stay right here. Extended coverage continues.